You're standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store on a Tuesday morning holding two nearly identical boxes of the same brand, trying to figure out why one costs 40 cents more than the other when the email arrives. Subject line: wire confirmation, closing funds received. No exclamation point, no congratulations, just a confirmation number and a dollar figure sitting in 12-point font the same way it would sit if it were a receipt for the boxes in your hands. You read it once, standing under fluorescent lighting between the oatmeal and the granola bars. And then you put your phone back in your pocket and you put the cheaper box of cereal in the cart because it's the same cereal and there was never a reason to pay 40 cents more for a different picture on the front of the box. $9,412,000 net, after the earnout adjustment and the escrow release, sitting in an account you haven't renamed. Nobody in the store knows. The cashier doesn't know. Your own mother doesn't know yet, and won't for another 6 weeks, and even then she'll find out almost by accident. The levels don't feel like levels when you're inside them. Everything eventually just becomes Tuesday. You'd met Dominic at a founders meetup 4 years earlier, back when both of you were running companies that fit on a single laptop and a shared belief that the exit was somewhere just over the next quarter. His company sold first, a scheduling tool for dental offices, acquired for $1.8 million by a company twice its size that mostly wanted the client list. He announced it before the ink was dry. A LinkedIn post with 3 paragraphs and a photo of a champagne bottle head bought specifically for the photo. Within a month, there was a Tesla in his driveway, then a downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows he posted at sunset, then a watch he wore in every photo afterwards, angled just slightly toward the camera so the dial caught the light. Dominic financed the Tesla over 6 years. He tells you this over lunch, unprompted, the way people tell you things they've rehearsed the explanation for. He says the payment is basically nothing next to what's coming, which is a sentence people only say about a future that hasn't arrived yet. The car costs $94,000 with the upgrades he didn't need. Against his actual take-home after the acquisition, the $1.8 million minus taxes, minus the earnout he hadn't fully collected yet, minus the 2 co-founders' head had to split it with, that Tesla isn't dollars. It's roughly 14 months of what he has left after the loft's mortgage, already spent before the car has driven its first mile to the same dental office parking lots he used to sell into. He calls the loft an investment in how people perceive the brand, by which he means his own name. It is not an investment, it's a lease with better finishes, and the moment the acquisition earnout stops paying out on schedule, which it will 6 months later, when the acquiring company misses its own quarterly numbers and slows every deferred payment across the board, the loft becomes the single largest monthly obligation in his life, sitting there regardless of whether the number behind it is still growing or has quietly started to shrink. This is the first quiet truth underneath everything that follows. The loud exit and the real exit are almost never the same event. Dominic announced his before head fully collected it. You haven't announced yours at all, 6 weeks in, and you're not sure you ever will. He wanted the champagne photo to say something about him before anyone had to ask. You have never once needed a photo to say anything on your behalf. Your car is the same 2017 Civic you bought used the year you started the company, and the only thing it announces to anyone is that you haven't gotten around to fixing the check engine light, which has been on, off and on again for 11 months. At the same lunch, Dominic asks what you're driving these days, half a joke, half genuine curiosity, dressed as a joke. You tell him the Civic's still running fine. He laughs, assumes you're being modest, and orders another round. He has no idea the number that closed 6 weeks ago is more than 5 times what his entire company sold for. You don't correct the assumption. Correcting it was never going to make either of you happier at that table. Neither of you is a bad person, and it would be easy for this to sound like contempt, which isn't the intention. Dominic is doing something almost everyone is quietly taught to do without ever being told they're doing it, solving a status problem with a financial instrument, and mistaking the relief of the purchase for the arrival of the thing the purchase was supposed to prove. He wanted the champagne photo, the loft at sunset, the watch angled toward the light, to arrive at a conclusion about him before anyone had to do the work of asking. You've never once needed a photo to do that work on your behalf, and it isn't a virtue exactly, more a byproduct of 9 years spent watching a business' actual health look nothing like its Instagram version. The Sunday after the wire lands, you sit at the same kitchen table you've sat at for 9 years, with the same coffee mug that has a hairline crack along the handle, and you do exactly what you did the Sunday before the sale closed. You open a spreadsheet, you go through every recurring charge across every account, one line at a time, the same 11 to 18-minute ritual it's always been, regardless of how many zeros just changed somewhere else in your financial life. You find a $9.99 charge for a project management tool the company used to use, still auto-renewing on a card that technically belongs to an entity that no longer exists in any operational sense. You cancel it. $9.99 means functionally nothing against $9.4 million. You cancel it anyway, because the habit was never really about the $9. It's about never being the last person in the room to notice something's gone quietly wrong, and that discipline doesn't get to take a day off just because the number behind it got bigger. You move a fixed, boring percentage of the sale proceeds into an account you've deliberately made inconvenient to reach. A different institution, no linked debit card, a 2-day transfer delay built in on purpose, so that no decision made at 11 at night on a bad day can touch it before morning gives you a chance to reconsider. You didn't do this because you don't trust the market. You did it because you don't fully trust yourself in the first 6 months after a number like this arrives, when everyone from your accountant's office to the private banker who's been emailing you weekly wants to sell you a version of urgency that has nothing to do with your actual timeline. Your business partner, Alina, who took her 40% of the proceeds and has been noticeably harder to reach since the closing, calls you on one of these Sunday mornings to ask, half joking, if you're still doing the spreadsheet thing. She means it kindly, the way people mean things when a habit starts to look a little strange against a bank balance that no longer requires it. You tell her you are. She laughs and says she hasn't opened her banking app in 2 weeks, which she says like a flex, and which you privately recognize as the beginning of a problem, though it isn't your place to say so out loud to a woman who just funded a kitchen renovation with money that was supposed to be a decade of runway. What she doesn't see, and what took you years of running a company on thin margins to fully absorb, is that the 18 minutes were never really about the money at all. They're about staying the kind of person who checks, who notices the small drift before it becomes the large one. Whether that drift is a forgotten subscription or a business relationship, quietly going sideways, or a spending pattern creeping upward, one convenience at a time. The growth, all of it, the entire 9 years that led to that wire confirmation in the cereal aisle, happened in exactly this kind of flat grey middle, where nothing was cinematic and nobody was watching, and the only audience for any of it was a spreadsheet and a mug with a cracked handle. Boring was never the obstacle. Boring is the qualification, and it doesn't expire the moment the number changes. 9 months after the sale, the acquiring company that bought Dominic's scheduling tool posts a quarter so bad it makes 2 industry newsletters. Deferred earnout payments across their entire portfolio of acquisitions freeze without warning on a Wednesday afternoon, a line buried on page 14 of an investor call transcript that almost nobody outside finance reads closely enough to notice, except the handful of people whose personal finances are quietly built on top of it. Dominic calls you that night. His voice has a texture you haven't heard from him before, thinner than the version that orders a second round at lunch, like something underneath has gone hollow and the sound is only barely making it across the distance. The loft payment is due regardless of whether the earnout arrives. The Tesla payment is due regardless. Head been counting the remaining earnout as if it were already sitting in an account, the way people do when a number has been promised to them in writing, and writing starts to feel the same as arrival. You listen. You don't say the thing you're thinking, which is that his entire structure was built for the version of the story where the second half of the check always shows up on schedule. No delay, no dispute, no missed quarter 3 states away, at a company he doesn't control, and never did, even while he was cashing checks that came from it. Same storm, different boats. The habit that made the difference for you that week isn't dramatic in the slightest. You'd taken a fixed portion of your own proceeds, separate from the boring Inconvenient account, separate from anything invested in the market, and left it sitting in something that pays almost nothing and does almost nothing, purely so that a Wednesday like this one, whenever and however it eventually arrived, would cost you a few uncomfortable phone calls and nothing structural beyond that. You built this months before you had a single concrete reason to think you'd need it, back when it felt almost wasteful to let that much sit idle instead of deployed somewhere with better returns. It felt wasteful right up until the Wednesday it wasn't, at which point it stopped feeling wasteful and started feeling like the only decision in the last year that mattered more than any other single one you'd made since the wire cleared. The surprise has a comma in it, but a system was already standing there, waiting, built quietly in the months before the blow had any reason to exist yet. You don't offer Dominic anything on that call beyond listening. There is no version of that conversation where handing him money fixes a structure that was never sized to survive a delay in the first place. It would only push the same reckoning 6 more months down the road at a slightly larger number, with a lesson still unlearned underneath it. Over the following months, you watch, from a slight distance, what happens when the cushion doesn't exist. Dominic lists the loft within 8 weeks, sells it at a loss once the broker fees and the market's own soft quarter are factored in, and moves into a one-bedroom rental across town that he describes, without apparent irony, as temporary, just until the second earnout tranche clears. The tester goes next, traded in for something smaller and considerably less announced. None of this is a moral failing on his part. It's an arithmetic one, set in motion the week he signed a lease and a car loan on the assumption that a payment schedule 3 states away, controlled by people he'd never met, would behave exactly as promised for the next several years running. The Frozen Earnout didn't create the vulnerability. It only revealed it, the way a slow quarter reveals which structure was never actually built to withstand one. There is a man named Walter, who used to do the company's books before you sold, back when the company was 3 people in a shared office space above a dry cleaner. Hez semi-retired now, still takes on a handful of small business clients out of a home office because, as he puts it, sitting completely still has never once agreed with him. Walter drives a 2009 Camry with a sun-faded hood and takes his lunch from a soft-sided cooler he's had longer than some of his clients have been in business. He also, you learn almost by accident one afternoon while dropping off a folder of documents at his house, owns 3 small apartment buildings outright, free and clear, purchased over 11 years, 1 property tax auction, and 1 patient closing at a time, generating enough in rent alone to cover his entire modest life twice over without touching another dollar of income. You ask him carefully why none of it shows anywhere, no new car, no different house, no single visible sign in the 11 years that anything had changed. He tells you he bought the first building the year his youngest finished college debt-free, using savings that had been sitting untouched specifically for that purpose since before she was born. The second and third came later, each one bought only after the one before it had fully proven itself. Never on hope. Never on a projection someone else had built for him. He says it wasn't a decision to hide any of it. It simply never occurred to him that anyone needed to know. The buildings weren't a reward for anyone watching. They were, in his words, just where the money went instead of somewhere else, said the same way another person might describe a grocery list. That's the quiet truth underneath everything Walter has ever done with money, and it's the same one Dominic never learned. The willingness to buy something substantial only after it's already been earned twice, once in the purchase itself, and once in the years of restraint and proof that made the purchase safe rather than fragile. Substantial things were never the enemy in any of this. Buying them before they've been earned twice is. He tells you one more thing before you leave, almost as an afterthought, closing the folder you'd brought him the same unhurried way he closes every folder. He says the moment his daughter's tuition was fully paid, off any debt, the first building stopped being something he wanted and became something he could finally afford to want without it costing him anything he wasn't already prepared to lose. You think about that sentence longer than you expect to, driving home past the same dry cleaner storefront the old office used to sit above, now a nail salon. It reframes something you hadn't fully put into words yet about your own $9 million sitting quietly in 3 separate accounts, untouched, unrenamed, unannounced. Your father calls at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, which is unusual enough on its own that you know before he finishes the first sentence that something is wrong. Your mother collapsed at the grocery store, the same chain, a different location, an ordinary Tuesday interrupted the same way yours was 6 weeks after the sale. And she's in an ambulance, headed to a hospital 40 minutes from where you grew up. You book the first flight out. It's $1,140 one way, the kind of last-minute fare that exists specifically to punish people for having emergencies on a Tuesday night with no notice. You do not open your banking app first. You do not run the mental math you would have run 3 years ago, back when the company's cash flow was thin enough that every unplanned expense triggered a quiet, involuntary subtraction in the background of every other thought in the room. The cost simply doesn't attend the moment. It isn't in the room with you at all, not even as a passing shadow. This is the truth every other habit in this story was quietly building, and it's the only one that isn't really about money at any point. It's about what the $9 million was for the entire time, underneath the Sunday spreadsheets and the inconvenient account and the fixed portion left idle on purpose. Not the loft Dominic photographed at sunset, not the watch angled towards the camera, Not even Walter's 3 buildings sitting quietly behind a faded Camry. It was always, from the very first dollar the company ever earned 9 years ago in that shared office above the dry cleaner, about purchasing its own absence from your mind, so that when your father's voice cracks on the phone at 11:40 on a Tuesday, your full, unmortgaged attention belongs entirely to him and to nothing else competing for the same 11 seconds. That's the highest job money ever does, and almost nobody markets it that way because it doesn't photograph well and it doesn't fit in a caption under a champagne bottle. It doesn't buy status, it doesn't buy a loft or a watch or 41 strangers agreeing you're blessed. It buys the silence in which the only thing that actually matters that night, your mother, stable by the time you land, a minor cardiac event caught early, weeks of follow-up ahead but no tragedy, can be heard without a single other thing competing for the same attention. You land at 4:15 in the morning. Your father is in a waiting room chair too small for him, a vending machine coffee gone cold in his hand, and he doesn't ask you a single question about money because it has never once occurred to him that money might be the thing standing between his wife and the care she needs. That absence, the fact that the question never even arrives in the room, is the entire architecture of the last 9 years, made visible for the first time in a hallway that smells like antiseptic and old coffee. You fly home 3 days later, and the check engine light in the Civic is still on, exactly where you left it. You finally take it into the shop on a Thursday afternoon, on the way back from the hospital's follow-up call. A loose gas cap, it turns out. $4, 90 seconds, the smallest possible problem, one that sat there patiently through a wire confirmation, a Frozen Earnout, and an 11:40 p.m. phone call, waiting the entire time for a version of you that finally had a spare 90 seconds to spend on something that's small. Money never fixes a Tuesday night. It never fixed the hollowness in Dominic's voice on that call about the Frozen Earnout, and it wouldn't have arrived any faster if you'd told him that night. The real number sitting quietly across your accounts, it would have changed nothing about a loft payment already due or a structure already built on the assumption that nothing would ever slow down. Money doesn't undo decisions that were already made months earlier. It only decides, quietly and years in advance, whether the next hard Tuesday costs you a system or costs you everything you thought you built. You still haven't told anyone. Not because you're ashamed of it, and not because you think anyone would treat you differently, though some of them would. It's because the telling was never the point. And somewhere around Walter's 3 buildings and a faded Camry, you finally understood why. The habits were never really measuring the sale price at all. They were measuring how much of your mind the number occupied. The app refreshing at midnight, the loft payment recalculated every time an industry newsletter mentioned a slow quarter, the low hum of financial performance that Dominic carries into every ordinary Tuesday, whether or not anything is actually wrong that week. You see him sometimes still, at the same founders' meetups, and he asks how the exit's been treating you in the tone of someone who's stopped assuming anyone's doing especially well, because his own definition of doing well got quietly recalibrated the week the earnout froze. You tell him it's been fine. It has. It isn't a performance either way. That's the part that's easy to miss from the outside. The absence of the show isn't its own kind of show. It's just Tuesday still, the same as it was in the cereal aisle with 2 boxes in your hands and a wire confirmation nobody else had read yet. Your mother, once she does find out, 6 weeks later almost by accident, when a bank statement she was supposed to see arrives forwarded to the wrong address, asks you exactly one question about it. Sitting at her own kitchen table with her own coffee gone lukewarm beside her. She doesn't ask how much, though she'll learn that eventually too. She asks if you're still going to come by on Sundays. You tell her nothing about the money changes that, and you mean it, and it's the easiest true sentence you've said about any of it since the wire confirmation first showed up between the oatmeal and the granola bars. And now that so little of that space is occupied in you, now that the 18 minutes on a Sunday and the fixed portion sitting idle on purpose and the buildings bought only after the tuition was gone have all quietly done their work, what fills the room where the worry used to